Welcome back to Deconstructive Criticism. I am ARON FLAM, and if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know that one of the staples is researchers in psychedelics. Consciousness, religion, philosophy, technology, and the next step in our evolution are all subjects that intersect in the human propensity for getting fucked up. Unfortunately, the war on drugs put a moratorium on research into hallucinogens for nigh on half a century, delaying what could prove to be vital research into these fascinating compounds. But since more and more countries are coming to the realization that the war on drugs has been misguided, to put it lightly, it is getting easier and easier, though it is still pretty hard, so don't break out your home chemistry set just yet to get permits for research. One of the goals of this podcast is to collect all of these explorers. Previous episodes feature among others David Nutt on LSD and Jordi Riba on ayahuasca and DMT. Links can be found beneath this episode on my Patreon page. Which reminds me to remind you that even though my business model is to produce and publish for free, donations are more than welcome. My name on Patreon is ARON FLAM, that's Aaron with one A and Flam with one M. Donate as much or as little as you like. With your help, I have already paid a hefty sum of money to Squarespace to start building a website for this podcast, where I hope to publish both this podcast as well as texts and video content. Also, with your help, I will soon be purchasing a new computer that lets me record better sound and image over Skype, as well as possibly give me the power to edit some content myself. Something my current computer, a very old douchebook Air, doesn't seem to be able to do very well. If you're Swedish, you can always swish me on 0768943737. That's 0768943737. Earlier this spring, I went to a lecture by a visiting researcher named Tomas Palenicek on psilocybin and the psychedelic experience. Not only did Tomas reveal new data on the molecule that has made magic mushrooms such a popular portal to the divine for the last tens of millennia, he also confirmed some previously held beliefs about punk music. Tomas' research focuses on psilocybin's effects on perception, psychedelic experience, and neural dynamics. Tomas's field, therapeutic application of psychedelic substances, have grown in popularity in the last few years with promising results from small studies. But what do we really know about its long-term effects? And why would a psychomimetic state have a long-term positive effect? These are the type of questions that interest Tomas Palenicek. Tomas is a medical doctor and PhD. He has spent the last 15 years of his life researching MDMA, LSD, ketamine, 2CB, mescaline, and cannabis. Sounds like a lot of fun, doesn't it? At the moment, he's leading an fMRI-study at Prague Psychiatric Center to chart the effects of psilocybin on perception and neural dynamics. Enjoy. Welcome to Sweden, Tomas Palenicek. Is that the correct pronunciation of your name?
Well, almost. In Czech we pronounce it Tomas Palenicek, but you did well.
Okay, Tomas. Welcome to Sweden.
Yeah, thank you.
You are a researcher
Yes.
in psychedelics,
Yes.
and you have just finished a pretty large study.
Well, it's not finished yet. The first part of the study is finished, but yes, we finished a pretty large study with psilocybin in healthy volunteers.
So could I just ask, what type of researcher are you to begin with?
Well, I'm a neuroscience researcher, and my education is both doing preclinical science as well as clinical research, and I'm also a clinician as a psychiatrist.
Okay, and you're from the Czech Republic?
I'm from Czech Republic. I'm from Prague. I was born in Prague, and most of my life I spent in Prague. I never traveled for longer time outside of Prague, like working in another facility or in another institution. But yeah, I stay in Prague.
And your research, the latest program, is on the molecule psilocybin.
Yes.
And that is the active substance in magic mushrooms.
Exactly.
And how did you get into that area of research?
Well, actually, that happened probably already when I was on a primary school and high school. I was interested a lot in chemistry, and I was studying some books about alkaloids, compounds that are natural drugs that are present in plants, and I was fascinated by opioids and fascinated by stimulants and whatever. And
how old were you?
I was like 14 years old, especially.
All right.
And
it's a very unhealthy interest for a child.
Chemistry. Well, I never was interested in.
If you're into the Breaking Bad part of chemistry, yeah.
Well, I don't know why it was attracting me, but well, it attracted me, and today I must say it wasn't that bad that it attracted me at that time. So, and initially I wanted to be a chemist, and then I had a very interesting interview with one of the professors of the medical faculty, like deciding to which university should I go after finishing high school. And this professor told me, like, okay, if you go for chemistry, you will just be a chemist and you will do chemistry. But if you go for medicine, you can do much more things. You can do chemistry, you can work with people, you can do research, you can do preclinical science and whatever you want. And he gave me a book, and this book was about hormones. So I make some presentation at school, and the last word of the book was written by Isaac Asimov. And I was at the time real fan of Isaac Asimov and this Foundation, I think it's in English,
Yes.
the name of the
Foundation trilogy.
Yeah, Foundation Hexology. No? Six books actually, I think.
Is it? All right.
Yeah. I think, if I remember it correctly. So that was the reason which forced me, like, or which made me to decide myself that I probably should go for medicine. I was accepted for chemical universities, but then I tried to pass the exams for medical faculty, and I was accepted for one, so I started to study there.
What was the last line of the Asimov book?
What was the last line of the Asimov book?
Was there
last word?
Yes.
It was because Asimov was biochemist, so he was. I don't remember anymore because it's like maybe more than 20 years ago. So, but just it was like one small page saying something about hormones, and it was written by Asimov. So I said, okay, maybe that's the way I should go in the future.
So you've had no personal experience with drugs before you went into the field of research?
Of course I had. Like Czech Republic is one of the countries where people are experimenting a lot. And initially I didn't have the experience, of course, like on the high school. But then, of course, during the late years of being at a high school and during studying medicine, I had experiences with various compounds as a recreational user, let's say. Course.
Yes, but because that's because I was at your lecture yesterday, and you mentioned MDMA, and you said, well, this was back in the 90s, I suppose.
Yes.
Yes, and so that was your drug of choice at the time, or?
Well, I experienced MDMA like most of the people around my circle from the group where I was present, and but after some time of the life, like let's say 2 or 3 years of partying and so on, most people just stop doing these experimental usage, and we turn back to more relaxed fun and going back for sports and things like that. So
and a beer.
Yeah, and a beer, Czech beer, of course.
Yes. So so that was your personal experience, and did that make you curious about consciousness at all, or? Was there other aspects of the drugs that you were interested in research-wise?
Well, I was interested in how they affect the brain. I was interested in how they affect the brain and how these powerful compounds can induce such profound changes of consciousness, and whether they can be also used for treatment. And actually, one of my first ideas when I started to do my PhD was why we should not try to use MDMA to treat depression.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't have the background and the knowledge why it probably wouldn't be effective in depression. But with the knowledge we have now, we know that MDMA can be used in the treatment, and it's started to be used in the treatment of PTSD.
Yeah.
And the phase 3 clinical trial is on the way. So the usage of these psychoactive compounds in clinics seems to be, or seems to have some renaissance, let's say.
Yeah, but it's primarily to deal with trauma and not depression of a long-term kind.
MDMA is not for depression at this time, but psychedelics like psilocybin or ketamine or maybe LSD as well, or ayahuasca, they seem to be quite powerful tools to treat pharmacoresistant depression.
Yeah, as you said at your lecture, the results you've found so far are actually fascinating. But what separates your study from Robert Carhart Harris' study?
Well, the first moment was like we wanted to work with these compounds in humans for a long time, and since there was no such research in Czech Republic ongoing since the 70s, we wanted to start with something much earlier before we started this clinical trial. So we started with studies in animals with MDMA, LSD, and other psychedelics, and then we moved through these preclinical experiments to first clinical experiments with ketamine, which was at the time legal. But still, the intention was to use psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD in the human research. But that was a big challenge because there were no there were no ways or no approaches or manuals how to use these compounds in healthy volunteers or in patients. So it was like a journey to get to these compounds. And this first study was mainly designed. We designed it as, or we used psilocybin as a model of psychosis, but because that was the most feasible way how to start working with these compounds in healthy volunteers. And of course, the intention was like to prove the safety in our controlled setting, to look on how the brain works during the altered state of consciousness, which might resemble psychosis, and then to plan future studies where we want to go more deep into the brain functioning and also to the therapeutic effect of psilocybin and possibly other psychedelics. So it was, let's say, safety study which should show the safety of psychedelic research in healthy volunteers and safety use of drugs which are not listed in between compounds with theoretical medical use or medical potential. And that was the most important step. So, like the reinitiation of real psychedelic research in Czech Republic.
So you started with ketamine because that was legal and judged as relatively safe.
It was legal, it is still legal, and the advantage of ketamine is that it is an approved pharmaceutical ingredient which is used for anesthesia. So to use it in humans, in other indication, you just change the indication, so it's much easier to follow all these steps. So then to register a completely new compound which is not listed in any pharmacopoeia, in any books which list medical compounds that can be used for medical purposes. So much easier to start with ketamine, definitely.
And you started with the psychomimetic approach.
Actually, it wasn't my project. It's my supervisor who wrote the first project on ketamine, Professor Horacek. And he started, again, to use ketamine as a model of psychosis. I was participating on this study. I was involved as a volunteer as well as an examinator. The first part was EEG MRI. Some of the data were already published. Some of them are still under the analysis. And then we did quite a lot of subjects on pre-pulse inhibition, which is like a method which measures sensory motor gating. That was mainly my part of the study, and I involved like 50 subjects almost, and it's also being processed and in the process of publishing. And hopefully this year we'll go out with the data as well. So that was the first study on ketamine as a model of psychosis, and afterwards, since already some information about the antidepressant effects of ketamine were published, we prepared another project and we started to work with ketamine in depressed patients. But before, we already gave off-label ketamine to one pharmacoresistant depressed patient, and we saw the effect that it's so dramatic and robust for a week. So that was the moment when we decided, okay, let's find a way how to change the indication and to use it as a treatment for resistant depression.
Yes, and from this you also got, because you divided it up quite nicely, the effects and what type of effects you have. Would you care to describe? Because first of all, you mentioned the psychomimetic approach, and there are other approaches that have been censored now for a better part of a half century, I suppose.
Yeah.
And those other approaches are, to begin with?
Well, there's one which is used like using the psychomimetic approach, which is psychedelics are used to model psychosis because the state is characterized by symptoms which are similar to psychosis. And then there are these two main therapeutic approaches, which is psycholytic and psychedelic therapy. These approaches were used mainly in the past, in the history, when psychedelics were freely used or experimentally used to treat psychiatric diseases or psychiatric disorders. And the psycholytic psychotherapy was using lower doses of psychedelics, but they will still maintain the contact with the subject who was under the influence, while psychedelic was using much higher doses when the subject gets into the complete psychedelic state where he might also lose the contact with reality, and the therapist then work with the integration of the experience after the intoxication. So these are the two main approaches in psychedelic and psycholytic therapy using psychedelics that grew
So
up in the future.
psycholytic could be more like a microdosing patient.
It wasn't microdosing. It were low doses. Microdosing is like very sub-threshold dose. It doesn't induce psychedelic effects. It has some minimal effects, which people can describe: increased anxiety, a little bit sharper. They see objects a little bit with sharper objects, and they might have more feel some somatic symptoms of these compounds, but definitely doesn't go into the psychedelic effects with visuals and so on.
The psychedelic effect could be more likened to tripping balls.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the scientific terminology. I didn't want to get too technical.
Well, psychedelic, the fully psychedelic. What means psychedelic? It means like soul manifesting. So it goes everything which is in everything what's inside of you can be open and overwhelm your brain or your thinking, and it's frequently accompanied by these visuals and with eyes closed, also with eyes open, and ego disintegration and so on. So this is not present definitely with microdosing, and could be partially present with the psycholytic therapy, but still the people know who they are, where they are, and they have a contact with the therapist. But I never did it. It's just like my knowledge, what I know from the books.
Okay.
And I never did psycholytic therapy and never did psychedelic therapy.
But you've done it yourself, on yourself, no?
Yes, I was also involved in these experiments, and to be honest, the doses that we used in our psilocybin or ketamine experiments were so high that it was for me like the full psychedelic effect, because in some points I really lost the contact with reality.
All right. So you're a scientist.
Well, it wasn't me first because I was designing the study, so I was at the first measurements, of course, but as a sitter. It was one of our colleagues was experienced and who agreed to be the first participant of the study, so we can, because we were building up the safety setting or safe setting and working with the subject with so many experimental approaches can be a little bit stressful to anyone who is not experienced and who has not knowledge about what you're measuring and so on. So the first experiments were like, yes, I want to see one or two subjects where I will be the sitter and supervisor and conducting these experiments to set everything well done, and then I went also into it. So yeah, it was interesting. We are not excluded, luckily, from this kind of studies.
Yeah, but what prompted you to move from ketamine to psilocybin then? I mean, specifically psilocybin.
Well, ketamine is not a classical psychedelic. It has a different mechanism of action, induces slightly different experiences, and psilocybin is definitely one of the compounds which is very safe, which has an acceptable duration of action, about 3 hours when it's the peak and 6 hours when symptoms worn off. So it's easy to handle in a controlled setting. And it was the serotonergic or the classical hallucinogen, classical psychedelic. So we wanted always to go into the research of these classical psychedelics because they are definitely different from ketamine and more interesting to my mind, I would say.
Yes, because their consciousness expanding. That's
Yes,
my words,
yes.
not yours. But yeah. So, so what was it that you wanted to find out about psilocybin?
Well, as I said, we started to use it as a model of psychosis. So we wanted to find correlates of the psychotic state using some neuroimaging approaches, methods, and we've selected EEG as one of the approaches and MRI as the second approach. And mainly we were looking on the connectivity and brain activity, and what we wanted to describe also is the time course of the effects during the intoxication, whether it changes over time. And in the next group, we also want to have a look on whether this changes persist for longer time in brain after the ingestion of the active ingredient. And so that was for the psychosis, and we also wanted to have a look on whether it is safe to administer to healthy volunteers. So we did this 1 month follow-up, how people respond, if they respond positively to the experience or negatively, or if it's safe to give psilocybin to also drug-naive subjects, which we were able to include in our study as well.
And when you say drug-naive, you mean people who haven't tried it before?
People haven't tried any psychedelic before. Most of the subjects were experienced with cannabis in Czech Republic, because we know the cannabis rates the lifetime prevalence of cannabis use in Czech Republic is one of the highest in the world. So it's very difficult to find someone who has no previous experience with cannabis, at least once in their life. Yeah. But there were some as well. But there were 7 subjects for the moment who had no previous experience with psychedelic drugs, no mushrooms, no LSD, nothing like that.
How did they do after the study?
Well, actually all of them did well. There was one subject whose experience was pretty much anxious, with quite a lot of anxiety. But then after a month of follow-up, she rated the experience as very interesting and very powerful, and that she wanted to go back into it and understand more what happened, because it opened some of the issues. And so that was one which had most of the experience filled with anxiety, but all the others, they referred it to be very interesting and one of the most powerful experiences they had in their life. And also, even though there was some anxiety present sometimes, as one of the most present experiences, and that's ecstatic-like experience or universe connecting-like experience they ever had.
That is a common experience for people who tries these substances.
Yes, but not all the time with very high doses. If they take it in an uncontrolled setting, I would say there might be a lot of experiences which wouldn't be so nice and wouldn't be so bad, especially if they were unexperienced and giving a dose which gets them directly into the full psychedelic world.
Yeah, you were very adamant with set and setting yesterday at the lecture. And I think that's good, because we don't want a repeat of the hippie era, because the pendulum can swing back, when it comes to research of this special kind. And you also showed a very nice clip from a Jack Black movie, I don't remember which one. And then you went in and you divided up the types of effects that can occur. And you call this the BPRS?
Yes, it's a psychiatric scale, brief psychiatric rating scale, which is used clinically to identify the main symptoms which are present in psychiatric disorders. So it detects symptoms of depression, of anxiety, or psychotic symptoms, which are typically present, and it's very easy scale. A few questions that are evaluated by the examinator or by the specialist or professional, and can be handled within 5 or 10 minutes. So it's a very useful tool if you want to look on the dynamics. There are of course other scales which are more related to psychotic symptoms like PANSS and others, but many of them, especially PANSS, takes much more time to evaluate, so it's not easy to do it during the course of the experiment, let's say 5 times as we did during the measurements.
Okay, so and you listed a few dimensions of ASC, which stands for, if I'm not mistaken,
it's Altered States of Consciousness scale.
Exactly.
Which was designed by Dietrich initially, and for this first 20 volunteers we used the old version with at least 3 main dimensions. And we didn't use the 5-dimensional Altered States of Consciousness scale, the updated one, which was created by the team around Franz Vollenweider, which we now implemented in the next 20 subjects. So this old version divides the psychedelic experience into 3 main clusters of effects. One of them is oceanic boundlessness, which is usually associated to the pleasurable effects. Losing boundaries and being connected with the universe or understanding everybody.
This is a Freudian concept. Yeah. I mean, I think Freud was the first one who actually coined the term, at least in published writing, where he said there's an oceanic feeling associated with religious fervor.
I don't know, maybe.
No, that's actually where it comes from. He had a friend who described the experience he felt when he was praying or participating in a religious ritual as oceanic, as you know, spreading out, ego dissolution. You could call it to a certain extent, couldn't you?
Well, ego dissolution, it's like the threat of ego dissolution is the second cluster of effects that can be induced, which is more mainly associated with like, it doesn't have to be completely unpleasant, but it's typically associated with anxiety and like loosening the boundaries of the ego, which could be associated with the unpleasant effects like ego disintegration, which can produce the anxiety.
Yes, but that's what's so interesting about, because you divide it, so you have, let's say, the three main effects are the oceanic boundlessness, is one. There's two, dread of ego dissolution.
Yeah,
and then three,
reconstruction.
yes, visionary reconstruction. But the first two, in my mind, seems just like different attitudes towards the same phenomena.
Well, theoretically, yes. It would be interesting to go on the specific questions that they ask on the same issue. But theoretically, finally, yes, it could describe the similar patterns, but accompanied with different emotional aspects that are related to going through these experiences. So I never had this idea. It would be interesting to go back into the questions and compare whether it's not asking on the same thing from different sides.
Yeah, because you know, there's this classic, you know, if you take hallucinogens, your body will be covered in insects. And I've actually had that hallucination. It's just that my attitude to insects is cool. I'm covered in insects. It's not, ooh, I'm covered in insects, which is a negative person's way of looking at being covered in insects. And you don't want to be a negative person, do you?
No, I don't want to, of course.
No. That was my question there, because I think that's quite interesting. Have you've experienced yourself the oceanic? Yes.
Yes.
And have you experienced dread of ego dissolution?
And quite strong one as well.
All right.
Yeah, it was especially like the first trip in the lab was very strong, and it was about completely losing my identity. And I almost, I was smashed to pieces, my ego stopped existing, and it was so visual that I didn't know if I have eyes closed or open, and the reality wasn't there, just simply I was blown up into somewhere.
Did you like it or not? No.
The first moments when I tried to control this difficult experience were very associated with a lot of anxiety and were very scary. Especially the thoughts like, if I will be smashed like that, will I come back or not? So these were the most anxiogenic moments of the experience. But then I said, okay, so if I do not exist, maybe this is an important part of my life, and I just said, okay, I won't try to control the process of being smashed to pieces. And then I got through this very anxious moments into the very pleasant states, being in touch with the universe and with everything.
So surrender basically is your tip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's definitely one of the very important things what people instruct in the in this experimental setting. We do not ask them to bring the intention because we do not work therapeutically. We work just like you're observing them. So we ask them to observe and not to control the experience, because it's just impossible to control it.
Yes.
And to be just the intention, let's say, is to be an observer, what it brings to you. So that was like the first instructions we gave to the subjects, and repeated them frequently on the initial interview, then before administering the drug for the first time. And it seems like it works well, and many of them reported, I was quite happy for this instruction, because it's really impossible to control.
Yeah.
Especially those who were not experienced before.
I'm sorry that I go through your entire lecture, but I found it fascinating, and I really liked the way you systemized the experience, because that made it feel more scientific, I suppose, and less religious. And I've always had slight problems with religion. Fascinating though it is, it does have negative effects as well, just like drugs.
Yes and no. It's very difficult. Everything could have both sides, good and bad.
Yeah.
And in general, there are of course people who might suffer bad experiences and longer lasting problems with the use of psychedelics, but it seems to be much lower incidence than with any other compound or any other drug.
Yeah, because that's one of the things you compared it with, what the negative effects could be compared to alcohol and ketamine or...
Well, for the classical psychedelics, at least from the studies that were published and the big population-based surveys, the very interesting finding was that there was less likely for people who are using psychedelics to have a suicidal behavior. And if they were with some psychiatric diagnosis, so psychedelic users were spending less time in being as an inpatient than population that do not use psychedelics, and it seemed to be associated mainly with the psilocybin use, if I remember correctly, this study. So that's one thing. The other thing is like the adverse reactions that might occur after psychedelic use. And even though there are like TSM and MKN, ICD-10
what is that?
classification of like the persistent perceptive disorder or so-called flashbacks, in both of these classifications of psychiatric disorders. These things are quite rare if you compare it to how many people use psychedelics. So yeah.
So what percentages are we talking about? Because you threw some percentages around yesterday. One of the most interesting results, by the way, was that apparently, according to your study or the study you cited, criminal behavior went down in people who use psychedelics.
Yes, that was a surprise to me, this study. And they looked on, I don't know if I say it correctly, it's like criminal offenders who were using drugs, and they were controlled for the use of drugs when they were out of the prison. And they found out that only those who were using psychedelics were less likely to being in prison back again, while all the others who use anything, including cannabis, were more likely to commit a crime again.
So basically, your criminal reform plan, if you were a politician, would be magic mushrooms to the criminals.
Hard to say, but it would be nice to repeat this kind of experiments, at least in some people. But
Yeah.
I don't know if this would be ethical, because like to study anything on criminals or people who are in jail, it's very problematic, at least from the ethical issues.
Yes.
Because these people do not have much
Choice. No, they don't. But you can have a volunteer study even in a prison.
You can have, but it's an issue. I've been in some ethical committees deciding about if they can check for some urine tests for presence of the new synthetic drugs and so on, and it's very, very ethical issue. And if I'm aware, at least from this ethical committee I'm sitting in Czech Republic, there was no study that was allowed to be performed on these people who are in prison at the moment, because it can be misused by the staff.
Well, it does make the mind wander towards less pleasant times in human history.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and you also did a comparison between psilocybin and DMT, and you said they have extremely similar. Or you could actually see on the results.
Well, that was because we used a scale, hallucinogen rating scale, which we want to validate and to have it also as a tool in Czech language for evaluating the effects of psychedelics. Not only the altered state of consciousness scale, it's also a scale which is rated by the person who is intoxicated, and this scale was first used by Strassman to describe the effects of DMT. And so I said, okay, so let's have a look how the effects of DMT looked like compared to what we work with psilocybin, and if the scale was translated correctly and so on. And I was so surprised that when I plotted in this graph the values of the individual subscales, we got almost the same image of this higher, I think it was the highest dose of DMT that Strassman used in his study, with the dose of psilocybin we used in our study. Of course, they used it IV. It was very short, much shorter acting experience than psilocybin, but at least the qualitative aspects of the intoxications were pretty much the same.
Okay. So, and this in general, we think now has to do with ego dissolution. It has to do with this higher connectivity or lower anti-connectivity between what you call them, schemata in the brain.
Uh,
Well,
well,
you because you brought up an
yeah.
image of the thalamus in the brain.
Yeah, about the networks.
Yes.
The three network model of how the brain works. This is far away to connect what we've observed in these behavioral tasks to what we've observed in these networks, and we still didn't make the analysis to look on how it is affected by not only ego dissolution but various aspects of these scales that we used to measure the behavioral effects of psychedelics or psilocybin. But this triple network model describes like the three main networks which are typically present in normal conscious state. One is the default mode network, which is now intensely studied, and is the network which is activated when we focus our attentions towards inside, when we are relaxed, closed eyes, and not attracting our attention to anything else except to the internal processes. Then it's the task positive or executive network, which is on the contrary activated when we focus our attention on anything outside of us. So if we are conducting any task, the task positive network is activated. And then from this theory, the third network, which is the salient network, decides whether or is like the switch, which switches between the...
It's a switchboard, basically,
yeah.
for information in the brain.
It
Should I
tells
turn
you-
inwards or outwards?
it tells you what is relevant and what is not relevant, where you should focus your attention or where you should move your attention. So what we found with psilocybin, that these two networks, which are normally the executive network and the default mode network, which are normally anticorrelated because we are not able to focus our attention inside as well as outside, at least in the normal state of consciousness. So we found that psilocybin decreased this anticorrelation. So actually it did that the borders in between attention going inside and outside were like dissolved. And that's probably what people experience, like being at the same time unable focusing attention on what's going on from the environment as well as what's coming from deep inside. So it really fits with how psychedelics works, and it also fits with the studies of others which found pretty much similar findings, not only with psilocybin but also with LSD, and mainly Robin who did this kind of analysis on MRI and EEG.
Yeah. No, I find it fascinating because also if you look at non-scientific literature on hallucinogens, like shamanic literature or whatever, they often start out by saying there are two types of trips, the internal and the external trip. And you can switch between the two during a trip if you want to. And it's just, I guess it's synchronicity in a way. That after a while, do you think that the science is affected by shamanic literature or ideas about trips or religious ideas about
Well,
hallucinogens?
definitely there's a group of scientists that is focusing on it. We also want to have a look a little bit on this effect of set and setting, how it might contribute to the experience itself, and whether it might have different long-lasting effects. So we plan to do some study with ayahuasca in the jungle in a traditional setting with all these shamans and rituals and so on, to compare it to the ceremony to the experimental setting where.
Do you need volunteers?
Yes, we need them. We have a plan how to make it. But we need volunteers that will be able to be in Amazonas as well as in the lab. So that's...
I will come.
Yeah.
I will come to the Amazon. I will bring my recording equipment.
Yeah, and the other thing is that if you want to make it in Czech Republic, then we need people who are like Czech citizens and speak Czech. So, because if we run something like that in Czech Republic, it must be under specific control regulations, and that would be an issue. So I think in the first part, like to go and do something with some people in Amazonas would be easier. Finally, even though it's not so easy because we communicate with some people from Peru, and the Peruvian legislation is also not so easy to deal with if you want to do real science and work with human volunteers and so on. And the other issue is like the Czech legislation, because ayahuasca is not registered as a treatment tool or as a pharmacological product, so it would be like an issue to administer something that was imported from Amazonas to healthy volunteers in Czech Republic. So that would be like another clinical trial that would take some time.
Yeah, I think Jordi Riba freeze-dried his drugs so he could control the substance better.
Yeah,
was quite an interesting approach.
That's what we actually want to do, like to freeze-dry the same ayahuasca that will be prepared for the ceremony in the Amazonas and to import it to Czech Republic. Because we can have the permissions to import. The question is whether we can get the permissions to export, because we are connected to some Peruvian institutes. So I don't know too much about the system, how it works in Peru, but it should work like the same almost in every country. There's like regulations how to import, export these psychoactive compounds. So, and we have the permit, so we can do it.
Yeah. So, but also you chose Peru. Out of all the countries in South America, and
most people work in Brazil. Yes. I don't know why. Maybe it's more feasible. There's longer tradition of ayahuasca use in the Santo Daime Church and like more publicly. Peru is now known for this ayahuasca tourism a lot, but it's probably something that comes from my heart, because I like Peru a lot. I was traveling there several times and I have friends there, and I'm also fluent in Spanish, so that's something, I don't know why, but
so it wasn't because you read Terence McKenna as a young man and you decided you wanted to go on the same.
No, I just one of it's to be honest, it's one of the options is going to Peru. The other is Colombia. And we're still deciding how we will make it. But yes, I just decided for Peru. And we also want to go to monitor the very traditional ceremonies of the indigenous people who are not affected by Western society that much. And since I met a friend who is an anthropologist and works deep in Park Manu, which is one of the most protected national park in the Amazonas, and he works with the communities there, so we can get an access there and do some science, hopefully some research. With this research we can at least monitor and have a look on the ayahuasca ceremony and the natives that live in the traditional way. So
it sounds like so much fun. I'm getting really envious and kind of resentful for not being a Czech citizen. And I know I don't speak Czech, at least not when I'm sober, but I don't know, on ayahuasca I might speak Czech.
You can learn it, and then it would be maybe possible to become... in healthy volunteers, no, it's not possible for healthy volunteers to conduct, to be a member of a clinical trial or to be a volunteer of a clinical trial that is under the Czech regulations. Unless you wouldn't be a patient. Then if you're a patient, then you can participate in clinical trials, but not healthy volunteers.
So
that's
I'm out, basically. Yeah. I'll come as a podcast observer from the outside.
But there are quite a lot of young people here who are like trying to bring psychedelic research into Sweden. So maybe you will get to the point where you might be a participant as well.
Well, Sweden has been one of the most adamant countries against liberalization of drug policy in the world, at least in the Western world, I think. But Swedes change quickly.
Yeah, but there is like liberalization and there is like scientific use or therapeutic use, and these things are completely different. To be honest, Czech Republic is one of the countries which is very, on one side, very liberal, or there's a lot of people using a lot of drugs. We are also one of the countries, if not the first country, with the highest prevalence rates of psilocybin mushroom use. Then at least on the first places, but I think it's about 7% of the young population had experienced psychedelic mushrooms. So it's very popular, as well as cannabis, where the data say up to in between 40 to 60% of young population had at least experienced cannabis. And that leads many scientists or many people, including James Fadiman, to say conclusions like, Czech Republic's drugs are legal. And this is not true, they are not legal. And we have
Because I heard it was at least decriminalized. But
it's not decriminalized.
no?
You cannot have drugs with you. You just it's illegal, but it depends on the quantity, and you can be just fined, or you can be put into the court, and the judge will decide if you cause a crime of possession, higher amounts than small. That's how the law is written, which is not a clever way how to write it, but it's not legal definitely at all. What has changed in Czech Republic that we have now new laws for medical cannabis, and we can also produce medical cannabis, and we can prescribe medical cannabis. That's, let's say, maybe the thing which is confusing in between decriminalization or legalization. So small amounts of any drug every person can have for their personal use, and they will probably not be imprisoned for that. But they might be fined if it's found and it's not legal. What is legal, that you can do with yourself whatever you want, so you can use any drug. No one can tell you anything if you will have 10 drugs inside your body. That's just your problem. That's like the basic freedom of Czech people. But they are not legal, so...
I understand. So one thing that worried me about your results when it came to psilocybin was... well, first of all, I want to thank you, because now we have black on white scientific result that punk music sucks.
Okay, maybe we should include the neo-punk.
Yes, because you did, one of the things you measured were how people react to different types of music.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we already know through cultural experience that a musical experience is enhanced on psychedelics. But you went into different types of music. So what different types of music did you test?
Well, we tested punk. There was some really hard guitars like Ministry, I don't know if you know it. Very hard electronic music with hard guitars like metal almost. And there was this classical music, there was some electronic music which is called dance music, there were Underworld for example. Then this psytrance music and some of the types of music which are frequently used as, let's say, the music for psychedelics or for meditation, relaxation, and so on.
Pink Floyd or no?
Sorry?
Pink Floyd or
No,
Whale
no,
song?
there was like Hendy Garner from there were I forgot all styles, all the names included. We can check on the slides then. But yeah, so the idea was to present different styles of music from different instruments playing as well, and let the subjects to decide what music they will prefer while being on psilocybin, because we feel like music is very important for the experience, and we do not want to induce bad experiences or bad moments during the sessions.
Yeah.
So initially we wanted to let subjects decide what they prefer to hear, and they choose classic music as being the most preferable in the relaxed setting. And then we saw this effect on psytrance music, which was like the highest increase in liking of this music.
People don't like psytrance when they're sober.
Well, because we didn't select subjects from this specific subpopulation of people who like psytrance, and average age was more than 35 years, I think, if I remember it correctly, or around 35 in the study. There were quite a lot of people over 40, and these never went into touch with this kind of music, and they said, well, what's that? Is this disgusting? It's like too much noises and too rhythmic and too loud and doesn't bring anything. But suddenly, when they got psilocybin, they started to induce it. They saw much more things in this music than before. So that was interesting, that also these people who you would not expect might like this kind of music. They rated it much better than without the drug. So
hallucinogens can decrease your taste in music. It can worsen your taste in music. That's what you're trying to tell us.
Theoretically, well, it enhances the perception of music. That's one thing.
Yes.
And to be honest, theoretically, yes, it enhances the liking of the music. So
yes. And understand, you get a new understanding for music.
Yeah, because maybe it opens the way you understand the music. So it's opens the doors to to understand also different styles of music that you previously wouldn't able to understand.
Yes. No,
Not
it
able
was
to
a
understand.
comically pointed
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, but it's a good question.
Yes.
It's a good question.
So and that leads me to the question I was posed, because then you went in to see what type, how it affects. I mean, some of the effects we know it alters the perception of time, for instance. But one of the things you found was that the subjects, at least when they were coming down from the trips, they were less probable to recognize fear in other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of. It's sort of made them into hippies.
Sorry.
It made them into hippies, sort of. No. They
Yeah.
see love and warmth and the connectivity of mankind.
Yeah. You're right. That's part of it, probably.
Is it?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. And it's probably one of the things why we believe that psychedelics might have antidepressant effects. It may be a symptom of the intoxication, but it also may be a symptom that persists for a longer time. And then, if you don't see fear or sad emotions or negative emotions, then we are more happy.
yes.
People who are like depressive and suffer from some anxiety and so on, they're more likely to perceive these emotions from people around. They're more sensitive to it. We know that. There's
Yes.
quite a lot of studies published on that. And if we block it, then we feel more happy because we're not responsive to such negative emotions.
And on an
in
individual
turn-
level, that's good. But
Yeah.
if you kick it up a notch to a societal level, where people suddenly stop seeing problems because they're only seeing the positive in the world and they ignore the negative, won't that have an aggregate negative effect on a population?
Well, hard to say. I don't know if like the hippie movement had a negative effect on the population. It definitely had a negative effect on psychedelics because they were banned afterwards.
Yes.
But I think like many of these, let's say, hippie people are now the opinion leaders that are in the governments and so on.
Yes.
And maybe that's why we are now in the period of renaissance of psychedelic research and interest in how they might affect our thinking and mind and connection to the world and nature and so on. So I don't think it was a negative effect.
No?
I think the negative effect might be that if you take it too much, then you might not see the reality as it is.
Yes.
And then it might be negative.
It
But
might be, because if you don't see problems, you can't solve them.
yeah, but on the other hand, like if you have one experience that brings you into such state as you can experience with higher doses of psychedelics, and it leads to this effect that you are like less responsive to the negative stimuli from the environment, then it's a very interesting experience. If you don't do it on a daily basis or on a frequent basis, then you still keep your criticism or critical approach, and you can solve it. At least I must say that from my personal experience, and also when I discussed with other volunteers from the study, like the experience of not having so much troubles in the life resulted in much easier strategies to solve problems instead of avoiding problems. So
So it's a question of moderate use, really. If you're sober, you might have too much angst to solve your problems. And then you take a little psilocybin, then you might be able to confront them because you get the energy. But if you do too much, then
then you
don't
might
stop.
not care about other problems. That's theoretical. It'd be nice to study that. If like people who are like taking psychedelics on very frequent basis, if what is their level of criticism or the level of ability to solve problems. But it's true, like the easy way in solving problems was described by most of the subjects. Like we have a lot of things, we're overwhelmed with work and stressed and not having much free time. And after this experience, everything was so clear and so easy, and just much easier cope with the daily life. It was interesting.
So in the long-term study, the effects afterwards were overwhelming, and the negative effects were lower than the positive effects, basically.
Definitely.
Yes. So.
And to be honest, we didn't have anyone who suffered like continuous, let's say, anxiety or something after the experience. But it might occur, and also Fran's team described few subjects that suffered from continuous anxiety after the experience, which was handled by psychotherapeutic approaches. So it can occur in few subjects, but at least in the subjects we maintained in the study, everything seemed to be positive in the long term and safe.
Yeah, cool. On a personal level, I have a long-standing love relationship with hallucinogens that's been going on since I was maybe 15, 16. And one of the things you said at the lecture yesterday I found very, very interesting, and it's the fact that people who use psilocybin is more likely to feel and or react to other people's negative emotions. You said when they were sober, not when they were using, but can there be like this effect in me that when I was a child, I have empathy, but not the full range of empathy. Maybe I pick up negative emotions from people more, and that makes me more likely to appreciate the effects of psilocybin, for instance.
Well, could be, yeah. It maybe showed you the way how to look on other people and how to cope with emotions of other people. And like, how do we interact with reality and do we perceive emotions of other people and how do we cope with it in the long term? It's a way that can change over time and during our life, and we are still learning. We are still having new adaptive mechanisms how to cope with with the reality. So you can experience like I'm a bit stuck in. You can experience stereotypes in your behavior, which doesn't result in good outcome, like that makes you, for example, more happy, and you repeat things that you are doing in a bad way because you don't see what's beyond it. And psychedelics might sometimes open your eyes and give you an idea on how to solve the problems in another way, like psychotherapy does, and it might show you these unconscious mechanisms and bring them to conscious level, and you might find a different strategy to deal with life and deal with daily life. So yeah, why not? It could be this effect. It showed you that you don't have to care about being sad or being receptive to the sadness that you observe, and it's much easier to cope with maintaining with positive emotions and looking on positive aspects in the future. I don't
That's
know.
no, I don't know either. But I'm asking you because you're the closest one to a person who could know in this world right now. And if you look at me when I was a child, it was like I was very good at seeing sadness, anger, and fear. And my reaction to that was to yell at these people, become angry, and defensive aggressive in a way, not passive aggressive, very
Okay.
actively aggressive.
Okay.
But like I did my first LSD trip when I was 15, and after that it started to decrease. My anger towards people's sadness or fear or anger decreased after that. So it was just an interesting find of yours that
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really wanted to ask about. Then we're coming to the end of the interview now, and I wanted to ask you. So, in general, what were your conclusions from the ongoing study on psilocybin that you?
Well, the conclusion. Well, I think one of the findings we didn't discuss until now, and which I found really interesting on our study compared to the studies Robin did and France did, that we were looking on the curse of the intoxication
Yeah.
and using these neuroimaging methods, especially EEG, and we found some dynamics of the change, and that it shifted the brain from one functional state that was at the beginning to another functional state, which was in the end, which was different compared to the one which was at the beginning, and it was also different to the one that was during the peak of intoxication. So I think for me, the main finding from our results is that psychedelics shifts us or can shift us from one functional state to another functional state, and theoretically, and that's what we want to look at in the future study, shifting to this new functional state might be responsible for the long-term effects of psychedelics. And if you look on some psychiatric disorders like affective disorders, bipolar disorder, people can switch sometimes from one mood state to another mood state very quickly. There are these ultra rapid cycles and that switch within hours, days or hours, and from one state to another state. So it's definitely not, according to my opinion, it's definitely not based on the fact that there is some structural change which is related to depression and some which is related to mania. So it indicates that the brain can switch easily through different functional states. Maybe psychedelics are one of these switches that helps us to switch from one state to another state. It doesn't have to be a state which is finally better. We know that people can be triggered to a state which is unpleasant, worse, and suffer anxiety. I also have patients that suffer from long-term anxiety after having a bad trip and so on. But it's just a tool which can help you to switch you from one state to another. And if it's done in a good setting with good sitters or shamans, most likely it switches you to a better state than it was before. And if it's done in the wrong way, then you're risking then you will be placed somewhere into the hell. So that's for me the most important finding, which I want to concentrate more on it, and what we designed the future experiments as well to look at.
So do you think that just showing people with the help of psilocybin, for instance, how easily they can switch between states, do you think the easiness of the switch is responsible for the long-term effect? Because what you're describing basically is you're describing my two modes of being. You're describing between depression and mania. Yeah. So the hallucinogen showed me that I don't have to be depressed. I can easily switch my brain and go into mania instead.
Well, not going to mania, but going to a state which is like, because, bipolars, especially these rapid cycles, they can exist sometimes at the mixed state, or it's so rapidly switching from one state to another. And
don't put down mania, my friend. I love the mania.
Yeah, okay. Some manias are good, some manias are not so good. Yes. Especially if they are so-called dysphoric mania. Then it's very unpleasant. But so switching to this new form of state, which might be more, let's say, stable and which might help you to cope with the daily life much better than before. It's a very important thing. That's maybe why it's also antidepressive, why it has also antidepressant effects. And that's a way how we should probably start to look on our brain as a system that can exist in various functional states or energy states, entropy states, or how we call it. And it's a way to learn how we can switch in between these states, not only using psychedelics. As a meditation, ongoing studies that look on whether we can switch our brain into the same state during meditation as during the psychedelic experience and so on. So there's a lot of other techniques that probably can lead to the same effect, psychotherapy and whatever. Psychedelics is just one acting. Acting, professional acting, that is. Yeah. That's what I'm training myself, because I'm normally very shy and like speaking in front of people. It's very difficult for me, but people usually say I don't look like that. No, you don't. I found the lecture yesterday to be very enlightening, and I want to thank you so much for coming to Sweden and shedding some light to our poor savage population about the proper use of hallucinogens. Okay. Thank you so much, Tomas. Yeah, and thank you for having time and for this interview, and I'm happy to be back in Sweden, and I hope to come back and to explore more the country. And we're more than happy to have you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yes. Thanks.
And thank you for listening and supporting this podcast on Patreon. Just type in ARON FLAM, that's ARON with one A and FLAM with one M, as in the old English word for false pretense, FLAM, where the word flim-flam comes from. Or if you live in Sweden, you can swish your support to 0768943737, 0768943737. Until next time, this is ARON FLAM for DEKONSTRUKTIV KRITIK.